Welcome to the Story Lab. Today we'll work on the Amazon streaming series The Lord of the Rings: The Rings of Power. Specifically, for this experiment, we will look at Rings of Power Season 1 and experiment on it to find a way to complete the Rings of Power and Númenor storylines, while getting the story as close as possible to the story and themes created by J.R.R. Tolkien and published by his son Christopher in form of the Silmarillion. Specifically, we seek to find a second and third season for the show, as well as a final movie to complete the entire story. Ready? Let's begin. First, let's compare the canon from the Silmarillion with Rings of Power Season 1 so that we can find out how the characters have to grow and change in the new seasons. Here are some aspects of the story to consider. In Rings of Power, Galadriel is the main character. She is quite emotional and frankly brash. She is very aggressive and had just at the end of the first season found out that Sauron had totally played her all along, leaving her quite disturbed. In Tolkien, however, Galadriel at this point is already a most wise ruler and guide to many. In particular, she is one of the few elves in Eregion who sees right through Sauron when he appears there to make the Rings of Power. Speaking of the rings, in the series the 3 elven rings were just created as the first ones. We know that 16 other rings will have to follow. In the book, on the other hand, it's the lesser rings that are created first, with the elven rings being the pinnacle of ring creation happening after Sauron has already left Eregion again. This is another aspect to consider. Sauron in the book presents himself to the elves as a Maia or Vanya, and thus as a guide sent to them by the Valar themselves. In doing so, he caters the trust of the smiths and helps them create the rings. In the series, by the end of the first season, Sauron only ever appeared as a man, not as Anatar, but he did already influence Celebrimbor directly to create rings. On another note, Celeborn and Celebrian, Galadriel's husband and daughter, are both absent from the series, while in the books, of course, Galadriel and her husband together found the realm of Lorien, and Celebrian is born sometime during the Second Age. The dwarfs, meanwhile, at least in the series, have just discovered the rare and precious metal called mithril. But they have refused to mine it. In the book, the dwarfs at this point are allied to the smiths and work with them on many projects. As for Gandalf the wizard, he is not present in the books until well into the Third Age, some 1,000 to 2,000 years after the fall of Eregion. In the series, Ganondorf has already arrived in Middle-earth during this time. With the realm of Mordor it is the other way around. In the series it has just been created, while in the books it had existed since the end of the First Age. As for the Númenorians, at the end of the first season, Isildur, a future hero and king, is lost in Middle-earth. In Tolkien's story, he is still a boy at home on the island of Númenor. The island, in the books, is ruled by Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, who lets himself be corrupted by darkness and Sauron in particular, which would lead to the fall of Númenor. In the series, a similar path seems to emerge, as King Palantir has just died at the end of the first season, leaving the change open for Pharazôn to take the throne. So, considering all that, what ingredients do we need for our story? We will follow the model set by the first season and focus on different storylines in different places, that in the end will have to come together for the finale. Every storyline shall have a different function. Isildur can initiate the Númenorians' conquest of Sauron by returning and requesting help from his kin. Arondir the elf and the humans of the south can function as scouts into the lands of Mordor, which are newly created and would be filling with vile creatures around this time. Gandalf must have no role in the story of the Second Age, meaning that his role must be secretive if he event gets a spotlight storyline. The dwarfs, preferably Durin for himself, have to open the mithril mine in their mountain so that elves and dwarfs can work together for a while before Eregion gets destroyed. Lastly, Celeborn must return to the world. Ideally, his reappearance can be the cause for Galadriel to miss Sauron a second time, when he inevitably returns to Eregion to help create the missing rings. There are some other story threads and characterizations that we have to consider. In doing so, we come up with a few more ingredients. Galadriel can lead a counterattack against Sauron's army when he attacks Eregion, keeping up her warrior persona from the first season. The ring wreaths should appear at some point, as they are very much connected to the Rings of Power. Anarion has to become a prominent character for the storyline. Harfoot should still have some kind of function, even if limited. The Bullrog has to appear, but he cannot destroy Moria. In fact, he has to be buried again. The show shall become progressively darker, so that it builds to the finale, which is the downfall of Numina. We also have to consider what is to happen to the many Amazon original characters that the show introduced and featured heavily. Those are some great characters, but if they are to fit into Tolkien's canon, we have to consider their fate. Here are the ingredients we're going to use. Durin and Disa have to die before the finale, since friendly dwarfs have little part in the War of the Last Alliance and their leader is not Durin. Nori, Theo, and other humans in Middle-earth have no place in the story, but they age comparatively fast, so they can just get old, effectively removing them from the story. Arondir is a fighter, he can die heroically. What about Irian and Farazan's son? They have to be connected directly to the fall of Numina to justify their place in the story, meaning they should be somehow pivotal characters in the Akalaberth legend. Okay, let's put all this together and let it cook for a while. We'll feed it to our computer. And hey, he already got a result for us, let's see. We got out 2 additional seasons of Rings of Power, as well as an Akalaberth movie to top it all off. Here is the story. We start off right where the last season stopped with the following events. Galadriel, Elrond and Celebrimbor look at the 3 elven rings and discuss the fact that the method of crafting them came from Sauron and what that would mean for their power. They agree with Galadriel that because Sauron never touched any of them, nor the materials, the rings themselves could not harm them. They send Elrond with 2 rings back to Lindon. The 3rd ring, Galadriel wants to hand over to Celebrimbor, but he refuses and Elrond suggests that Galadriel should use it, also to help her get the shadow of Sauron of her heart. Meanwhile Sauron, as Halbrand, enters a cave in Mordor and presents himself, as Sauron, to Ardar and the orcs. Ardar does not want to serve him again, so Sauron kills him brutally. Waldreg is given command over the people of the Southlands, while the orcs pledge their allegiance to Sauron again and start building him a tower. It follows a 20-year time jump to the main events of Season 2. We again follow multiple plotlines simultaneously that will in the end converge for the rest of the series. Dwarfs and Elves. Durin III has recently died and Durin IV, who has regained his father's favor in the past years, takes over the throne. He immediately commands the reopening of the Mithril mines, as Navi the greatest dwarven smith had already worked out several plans with Celebrimbor as to what they would craft out of Mithril once they had it. They would use the great new Forge of Eregion and start building another one in Khazad-dûm. Meanwhile Galadriel is walking around Eregion, always keeping an eye out for any possible disturbance through Sauron's influence. She is as determined as ever, however, she is much calmer and more grown up now, no letting herself be swept from one argument into another, but rather carefully and gracefully keeping an eye on everything. At first the primary group of suspicion for her is a club of young ambitious smiths under the leadership of Aestir. They are not interested in the chainmail and moon letters that Celebrimbor is developing, but rather want to make weapons, and they are very interested in the story of the 3 rings and wish to craft rings themselves, which they eventually do, as one of them speaks up that they should steal a bit of Mithril to do so. That elf turns out to be Sauron in disguise, of course. But Galadriel does not take note of this anymore, since her focus has by that time shifted to a strange elf that had been found wandering around in the woods. The elf does not remember his name nor his origin, but he seemed rather suspicious of everything dwarven. Galadriel, thinking he was really an enemy spy, followed him around and finally saw how he entered Khazad-dûm and, when cornered by dwarfs, inadvertently destroys the new Mithril forge. Galadriel, jumping forward too late to really stop him, gets trapped under a lot of rubble together with the strange elf. Speaking with him in the dark, Galadriel realized who the elf was. She convinced him to open his mind and let her in, whereby she confirms it, the strange elf is her long-lost husband Celeborn. With the grace of her magic, Galadriel restores her husband's mind. However, they are still trapped. Around the same time, Celebrimbor discovers that the young smiths had created 16 more, though slightly lesser, rings of power. They each put one on, however one of them seems to be missing. Celebrimbor realizes what this could mean, and he is very much right. The last smith, really Sauron in disguise, had returned to Mordor with a bit of mithril and is now, in the volcano, crafting the One Ring to rule them all. All the young smiths hear his terrifying laughter, and Gil-galad, Elrond and Galadriel realize too what had happened. However, none of them can do anything. Luckily, most of the young elves shed their rings immediately, them falling to the ground like stones. But Aestir still has his ring on and turns evil on the spot. Luckily, Navi the dwarf is there to get rid of him. Now Sauron is angered that his plan had not worked out. He orders his entire army to march out of Mordor and towards Eregion. Galadriel and Celeborn are meanwhile finally freed, and Galadriel quickly advises Durin to arm his dwarven forces so that they could put up a defense for Eregion. It follows the Battle of Eregion, where the orcs completely overwhelm Galadriel, the dwarfs, and the elven smiths. Galadriel and the dwarfs have to pull back and close the newly created doors of Khazad-dûm. Meanwhile, Celebrimbor is captured by Saruman and forced to reveal the location of the 16 lesser rings. However, he dies from the pain, before Sauron can force him to give up the locations of the 3. At the same time, Elrond is approaching with an army from Lindon, but is pushed back and finds a secret valley wherein he resisted the forces of the enemy. Meanwhile, in the Southland storyline, Arondir is still with the people of Pelargia, who are now led once more by Bronwyn. Arondir and the now grown-up Theo lead scouts into the mountains of Mordor and explore the land of the enemy. At the Sea of Nirnan, they try to speak with the fallen men, but no one listens. However, they do find a strange lonely man in the mountains. He lives there only with his horse. From his clothes, they recognize him as a Númenórean warrior. In fact, it is Isildur. He does need some elven medicine to remember his story, but as soon as he is back to being himself, he asks to be shipped back to Númenor to his family. Arondir agrees to take him to Lindon to ask for a ship, but on the way, they see Sauron's army march north. They have to take another route and come to Lindon only after the fall of Eregion. Círdan gladly gives Isildur a ship and he travels back to Númenor to ask for help. And now it is time to talk about Númenor. We learn the biggest news right of the back. Ar-Pharazôn is now king, having unjustly married his own cousin. Miriel is meanwhile being kept in the tower of her fathers. Elendil, having still no contact to Anarion and believing Isildur to be dead, tries to recruit Irion for his group of faithful. However, Irion refuses, believing that it was because of Miriel and Elendil that Númenor was to fall, not because of Pharazôn. She drops in her arguments that the king had a Palantir. Elendil plans on stealing the Palantir with the help of Isildur's friend Valandil, but Irion alarms her boyfriend, Pharazôn's son, leading to a fight in the king's tower, where Valandil is killed and Irion drops the Palantir to the ground. Pharazôn's son picks it up and sees the vision, but in his version, he does see his father's part play out. Telling the others of what he had seen, he switches sides. But Irion is confused and angry and ends up killing him. This is when Pharazôn arrives and Elendil has to give up Irion, as she is taken away. In reality though, the king is thankful, for he had known for a long time that his son would be a problem. Shortly after, Isildur arrives to everyone's surprise. When he speaks of the dangers in Middle-earth and Elendil reminds everyone that Miriel had promised to return for the fight, Pharazôn can no longer refuse. He gathers all his armies and goes to Middle-earth, slaying orcs and driving the armies back. Sauron surrenders, in Halbrand form. As the Númenóreans take Sauron away, Galadriel warns that that is a very bad idea. Nonetheless, she has to let them go. At the end, however, a grey pilgrim appears among the elves with a middle-aged half-orc by his side. He introduces himself as Mithrandir and says that he had travelled the world for many years, meeting his peers, who had landed in other lands in Run, and starting his mission to help the free world in their fight against Sauron. He asks though, that Elrond, who now has decided to build Imladris, accompany the little Nori back to her people. Wow, that was quite a season. Are you still here and ready for more? Well then, let's look what happens in our Season 3. There is another time jump, this time of approximately 3 years. We start off with the Galadriel-Celeborn storyline here. Elrond, Galadriel and Celeborn visit the Harfoots and are happy to see that everything is working out for them. But during their visit, they see a strange witcher pass through the lands that even Galadriel cannot stop. Galadriel and Celeborn immediately decide to follow him and track him through the Greenwood. However, their journey gets progressively more difficult, not only because of the strange and dangerous witcher, but also because Galadriel is pregnant. In the end, she collapses in a fight against the witcher. All seems lost, but then they are mysteriously saved by Entwives. They bring the elves to a field of flowers and their Galadriel has Celebrian. Afterwards, the Entwives bring them over the river, bringing them to Lorien, where Galadriel and Celeborn decide to stay. Meanwhile, in the south, Bronwyn is having a conversation with a king of the mountain folk of the Hidden Paths, because she wishes to build some new cities in the lands of Lebanon. Arondir is still guarding the land of Mordor, that has now gone quiet. He too observes a strange man pass into the land, that seems to have magic powers. Later, another passes by and one even comes from Numenor in a boat and walks into Mordor. Arondir and Theo decide to investigate and discover that a total of 9 men had gathered at the base of Barad-dûr. While they watch, the 9 all pull out their rings and turn completely into wraiths. Arondir realizes the danger and quickly sends Theo away, himself defending against the 9. He can hold them off long enough for Theo to escape, but then he is brutally murdered and the 9 let their cry be heard for the first time. Theo then travels to Gil-galad and tells him of this new foe. Gil-galad thanks him and asks him to be wary, as he feels that some change might soon come over the world. Gandalf also gets a story this time around. Traveling through the lands of the north, Gandalf finds a number of orcs that live in the mountains and have not yet sworn an oath to Sauron. He follows them north to Mount Gundabad, where they disappear into the mountain. Gandalf calls upon Radagast to help him and they walk into Gundabad, finding to their surprise a black dragon there. While fighting the dragon they learn from him that many more of Morgoth's creatures had escaped than previously thought. After defeating the dragon, they decide to go leave the elves for a while to search for more such creatures, as they could be great dangers in the future should Sauron get a hold of them. The dwarf story goes like this. In Khazad-dûm, Durin and Disa notice that their son is acting strangely, being very demanding and seeking treasures, digging ever deeper. Meanwhile, the dwarfs themselves dig deeper and deeper as well, trying to find more mithril. When Disa and Durin finally confront their son, they discover that he has been given a ring by a strange figure. Other dwarf lords around the world apparently have been given similar rings. Being unsure of what to do, they send their son to Elrond to Imladris. Elrond talks to him and tests him, discovering that the ring cannot corrupt the dwarf, only making him more eager. However, the son does not like to be used as a guinea pig and sneaks off, ending Elrond's good relations with the dwarfs. Meanwhile in Khazad-dûm a strange smell is noticed in the deep caverns. Durin and Disa climb down and ever further down until they, to their horror, discover the Balrog waiting under the stones. They fight the Balrog, finally stopping him by collapsing the ceiling on top of them, burying all 3. And finally, again in Numenor, at first, Pharazôn only walks to the dungeons to mock Sauron, but soon he listens to what the enemy tells him about the fate of men and the lies of the elves. Elendil meanwhile is still trying to assemble some faithful, which is getting increasingly more difficult. Finally, he managed to get contact with a large group, who he discovers is led by an Aryan. The family rebonds, except Irian, who is still a true kingsman, and they decide to speak out openly against the king and his decisions as of late. This is when Pharazôn kicks Elendil out of his council and gives the seat to Halbrand instead. Sauron immediately pushes for the White Tree to be burned. Isildur sneaks up into the palace and steals a fruit. Irian discovers him, but as she sees who he is, she lets him go. After that, Sauron makes Pharazôn swear an oath to Melkor and slays the White Tree. He also proves that Irian had willingly let the thief go, prompting him to convince Pharazôn that she must die. Pharazôn agrees, fully committing to evil, and lets Irian be slain in the central chamber of the palace. She dies horribly and the faithful realize that Numenor is lost forever. Thus, we have all storylines set up for a final movie. The Akelaberth. Elrond travels to Lorien to together with Galadriel witness the goodbye ceremony for Durin 4. There Galadriel warns of a cataclysmic change that she feels is approaching. Meanwhile, Elendil travels to Middle-earth to search for medicine for his son Isildur, who is not waking again. He meets Gil-galad and the two swear each other to work together, then Elendil returns to Númenor. All the while, Pharazôn is making cruel sacrifices and Anarion is working hard to save people on the Isle. Amandil their grandfather loses his nerves and, though he is an old man, boards a ship westwards. He is never seen or heard from again. Anarion preps the ships, as Elendil returns and heals Isildur. Then they all walk into the city trying to free Miriel from the tower. They almost succeed, but Sauron stops them and Miriel asks them to leave her behind, as they have to flee. Now Sauron asks that all faithful be sacrificed on the altars. Pharazôn has a better idea though, he wants to sail to Valinor to receive immortality. He preps a huge fleet and only Anarion, Isildur, and Elendil can escape with a few ships, taking along precious relics that Anarion had gathered in the west. Then Pharazôn sails west, disappears in the sunlight and the change of the world begins. Númenor falls and everyone dies, except for the ships of the faithful. They are brought ashore in Lindon and Pelagia, being welcomed by the elves and the men of the south respectively. Both of these groups have been shown fighting armies led by the Ringwraiths. Sauron is welcomed by the Wraiths in Mordor. In the closing speech of Galadriel, she explains the change of the world and the formation of Gondor and Orna. Then she mentions the last alliance and we see them fight against Sauron in Gorgoroth. The closing shots are of the three elven rings during the Third Age, Galadriel's, Elrond's and Gandalf's. So, in summary, Season 2. Sauron returns to create the other rings and finally his own ring. Celeborn returns, which keeps Galadriel from realizing that Sauron is there. All ends in a great battle, as Eregion is destroyed and the Númenóreans take Sauron prisoner. Season 3, darkness is rising both in Middle-earth and in Númenor. In Middle-earth the Ringwraiths appear and foreshadow the coming war. In Númenor Sauron takes charge and the Elendil family organizes its resistance. Movie, Númenor falls to darkness and gets destroyed and everyone comes together for the end of the Second Age. Let us make one final remark. On the ages of the characters, Tolkien made very clear that humans of different kinds age differently, while dwarfs age slowly and elves practically do not age at all. In the series, this shall be represented, the elves do not age during the runtime of the series. The Númenóreans age about 6 years over the whole series, which spans about 25 years, as you might remember. The men of the South age the full 20 to 30 years. Halbrand does not age, since he is Sauron. Everything presented here is simply the results of an experiment. No part of this presentation is intended as a correction of an existing story or claims to be the real story. The selection or omission of any parts of the source material is not to be understood as commentary, positive or negative, on the original productions. These are simply thoughts and experiments based on existing material and none of it could be created without the work of all those involved in creating the original works. As with any scientific result, you may utilize any of the story ideas that resulted from these experiments for your own experiments or production, while citing this experiment as its source. Well, that was the whole story. Thanks for watching.